Okay, thank you for tuning in to Stampscaping 101 Pigment Ink Applications Take 2. I did this entire video the night before, and I realized I didn't have my external microphone turned on, so I just reshot the entire thing. But I already had a lot of the applications down with the pigment ink on my scenes, but I've just reiterated what I already did, and I've added some fine-tuning. Sometimes when you add pigment ink down onto your scenes, it dries darker than it looks when it's applied, freshly applied and wet, okay? So, it's always good to kind of go back in there anyway, so I will show you where to apply pigment inks strategically in your scenes for kind of, to kind of refine the lighting scheme of a scene, and really especially how much ink to apply and what not to do, which is really more important than what to do with something like this. And I'll show you if you watch this video, but anytime anyone kind of gets into and experiments with this type of pigment ink application, at first they apply way too much ink, and I'll show you how to get your applicator set for this type of misty, foggy type of application of ink on here, okay? And it's really easy to do, but you just have to really take care of your saturation of media really before you start off with the process, okay? And I'll show you how dabbing off and your applicator will get your tool ready to go for this type of look, okay? And it's really easy to do. I think it's really quite effective in kind of creating this atmosphere and mood and extending your textural range of a given scene quite extensively with some very subtle marks with your white pigment ink, okay? Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it comes in handy for you, and if you choose to do this technique, I hope that it will have answered all the questions that you might have for it, and to get you started kind of on the right foot. And again, that's just not using too much of your media on your applicators, okay? Okay, welcome to Stampscaping 101. I'm on the final stage of my, the evolution, I guess you can say, of all of these card. I guess they're more than layouts, they're kind of final pieces. And what my final step usually is in the process of creating these dye-based ink on glossy cardstock techniques, at least, is to apply selectively some pigment ink applications. Okay, I'm going to show you where I add this, these applications, what type of ink, and really especially how much of these inks you add to those given areas, okay? Now, I made a really big mistake yesterday, or actually last night. I was doing this final video, I shot the whole thing, and I realized my microphone wasn't on, and I didn't really want to do a voiceover or something like that. Plus, the video was too long, as all of them really are. So I'm just going to reshoot it. So a lot of the ink applications have already been applied, really, to all of these. But one of the things that I mentioned in the video is that when these pigment ink applications are applied, they dry darker, okay? Usually when you apply dye-based inks and they're allowed to sit and dry, they dry lighter, but when it comes to pigment ink applications, they always dry darker, so it's always a good idea to kind of let things set up anyway, and to go back in and to fine-tune these applications, because the way that I use it here is to apply it in a very thin layer, so, I don't know, the opacity of it, they're never really opaque, but when they dry, they become much more translucent, and you can see the objects underneath them showing through much more distinctly. So I like to go with multiple layers anyways. So there we are. Okay, so let me do a quick lesson here, or demonstration, of what goes wrong when applying inks. All right. Okay. When people do this technique, I'm going to show you right up front what happens and what goes wrong with this technique when people try it out. And it's almost, I would say 100% of the time when people have a hard time with this, it is always this aspect, okay? Most of our pigment ink pads are very juicy, okay? And I'm talking about ones that we've been using over and over again. It could be 5 years old or something like that. These ink pads are very wet. The paint, I call it paint, the gel, the ink is very saturated in terms of our pads here. And most of the times, I don't know, some of you might use your white pigment ink pads all the time. Most of us don't. You can pull out a pad that's 5, 10 years old sometimes, and there's a lot of ink still in it, okay? So that when we apply our inks, I use cotton swabs. I think that's the, I don't know, that really works for me in terms of an applicator. When we dab, even though I'm not really dabbing in very deep into, now this one happens to be a brand new pad, but it gives us this type of application. It's a very thick application of that ink. Even though I'm just dabbing into it, you know, I can barely touch that page, you know, to get that mark. And it looks like that, right? Big globs of ink, okay? Now the way that I'm using it, I'm using the Hero Hues one right here. I'll talk to you about the difference between the Hero Hues, the Colorbox Frost White, and something like the Brilliance pad here, but here's the consistency you want. You don't want this consistency right here, okay? Now I'm really going to have to dab off a lot of this to get the consistency I want, okay? And I have no idea how many. I might have to dab it off 30 times. So, that being said, we don't want to have to do this every time we start utilizing the ink. So just don't apply, just don't, you know, dab so much ink into your applicator to begin with, okay? Just barely touch it, I would say. And test it out a little bit on a piece of paper, all right? All right, see, there's a lot in here. Let me see if I can squeeze some of that out or roll it out. Now, the thing about this is I'm really kind of smashing this tip down, and that's not bad because it kind of gives you a softer applicator, and we want to apply a soft application with this. If it's to represent something very soft and in texture, such as fog or something like that, we want a real kind of dry brush application of that. Now this is really soaked in there. Okay, now I've almost smashed this too much. You know, I'm almost down to the stick right here. But that's about the consistency we want right there. Watch this now. When I dab this, I don't know how many times I dabbed. That had to kind of take, you know, the ink out of it 60 times probably. But here's what we want. See, here's one dab right here. It's barely visible, right? So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. See, and it's barely visible. It's very translucent. It's almost like a very... The ink is not wet, I mean dry, but it's kind of like a dry brush application of something, okay? See that? I mean, I've dabbed it down there 15 times, and that's what we have right there. Much less than something like that, okay? Now, when I say that to people like that, you know, that's about how much you want. This is the way we apply it now, okay? All right, let's see here. When we start applying it, where do you apply it, okay? We apply this ink in areas where light meets dark, okay? So areas where you're applying a white application of this kind of misty appearance or misty kind of application, a very thin layer of that ink, it represents white light. So you have to have kind of retain some areas of white in your scene, because we're saying that that light right there, that's light, and that's the color of the light. So that if you have white light hitting moisture in the air, such as, you know, little particles of water, which is what fog or mist is. That's the color that that mist is going to be. So if everything is all, like, say, golden lights and yellows and reds and oranges, whatever, magenta for like a strong sunset color, you know, lighting scheme, then white just doesn't make sense because you would have colored light hitting that mist and it would be a different color. Okay, now you can use different colors of pigment inks, you know, to do this type of effect. I usually just go with white, though, for those types of looks, okay? So, let's take a look at this right here, and where white meets dark, meaning there's white back here, and there are some trees. Now, I've already applied this because I, you know, stupidly didn't turn on my I have this external microphone, so it's not connected to my camera, but see, what I'm doing is I'm kind of oscillating the look of the crisp application of ink. That doesn't make sense. Let me try to describe that differently. There are these trees in here that are crisp, black impressions, right? And that's what we want out of our impressions. We want them to be nice and crisp. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding some of this mist into it, and I'm kind of obscuring it a little bit, and I'm lightening some of it. And that's the thing that gives this illusion of kind of that suspended particles in the air being illuminated in the form of fog or mist or whatever. Now I've applied it down here too. I like it coming off of my meadow a little bit. Kind of like you know, this kind of wet dew covered morning meadow, I guess you can say. And I think that this kind of gives it some nice atmosphere. Now let me try to apply it where I haven't done it. Like I said, I already did it. I could have wiped all that off, you know, and started over for this video, but I don't feel like doing that. So let's take a look at this area right here, okay? Let's just obscure it a little bit. Let's add a little bit of this very thin layer, or a very thin application of pigment ink. And see where I've done that right there? Now that area right in here has that thin layer of mist. And I think that looks, you know, really good. It kind of oscillates the textural range of a given scene in a given object like that. And I think that looks really good to do that like that. Sometimes, another thing people do sometimes is they just cover everything, you know, and it's just too much. And then they say, I can't do it. But they can do it. They just added too much of something. So kind of oscillate it. Add it a little bit here and there, and I think it will give you a better result. Plus, here's one of my other tricks too. If you've watched my video on adding gel pen applications, sometimes I use the gel pen to reiterate the lighting direction. Now, what I mean by that is, here's our area of light right here, okay? And what I do is, on this side of this tree over here, I'll add some of this pigment ink. I'll do it on this one right here too. But see, on the left-hand side of that tree, oops, I've added some of that pigment ink, but on the right-hand side I didn't. Over here I added a little bit on that side of this tree. So it kind of reiterates lighting, so it looks like the light is coming from over here because these trees are lit on the left side. It wouldn't look like that in nature, but, you know, this is your scene. We kind of fudge things a little bit. What do they call it? Artistic, I forget the word. It's early in the morning, I can't think of it. Artistic license, okay? So see, on this side of these trees, it's on the right-hand side. I've kind of illuminated the right-hand side of the left-hand trees. Okay, now where pigment ink white doesn't really seem to make sense, this area out here is in a darker area, right? There's no area where white meets dark. okay, because it's just blue back there. I mean, I can maybe apply a little bit of it, and maybe it looks okay. Yeah, I mean, that looks okay, but I'm going to apply less of it. Okay, let me show you what I mean by that, okay? Oh, there's a little bit of it right there. I don't know if you can tell. Okay. Now let me just purposely add a little bit more, okay? I've re-inked this applicator, so, you know, there's a lot on here. I'll show you where it doesn't make sense, okay? All right, well, that's what people do right there when they add too much, right? The good thing about pigment inks is that if you don't like it, even after it dries, it'll come right off, okay? See that? It just buffs right off, and it's fine, okay? But let me show you right here, okay? Let's see. I might, like I said, I might be able to get kind of the amount that I want. I mean, that looks okay in there. But what I'm getting at is, if you don't have any of this lighter area in here, okay, in shadows, it means that in the shadow areas, in the darker areas of the scene, that means that there's no light in, you know, hitting those areas, right? So that if there's no light hitting those areas, you know, if the trees are dark, the shadows are dark, everything, that means that we're not going to have light illuminating that area, you know, these little particles of moisture in the air. So sometimes it looks out of place. So I usually apply it in my lighter areas, okay? Now let's look at that lighting direction up here. Okay, now see where I've kind of applied some over these tree branches? I've done it on the bottom side of it, right? Because when the trees are up here, they're kind of bottom lit. Not really, I mean, you know, that's not exactly where it is or something like that if it's out in nature, but I think it looks good in a scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply some of this ink down this way. And I will, it's kind of like turning your object in space, as they call it, you know. It's when you kind of change some of it like that. So you're saying that that object's more of a three-dimensional object by illuminating some of it and leaving the other part as is. And it really doesn't take too much. I mean, I already added some down there, but this right here, this little process of adding a little bit of pigment ink to this area, you know, it takes a couple seconds, and I think that really adds to that overall look. Look at the atmosphere in here now, just by kind of lightening up some of these areas with a little bit of pigment ink. It makes it a little bit more obscure. It pushes some areas back a little bit by saying there's moisture in the air between you and it. Maybe these trees back here, this is just all one stamp right here. Okay? But by adding some pigment ink over some of them, it almost pushes those back into the distance more. Okay, let's do that on some of them. And by doing that, it brings dimension and kind of distance into the mix. And it gives more space, kind of the illusion of space within a given design. I mean, it looks like those ones are farther back in the distance now, right? Let's take a look at the black impression would look like that. Okay, but look how it looks right there. And those subtle little changes like that can really make a big difference on the overall. It gives an atmosphere and mood, I would say. Kind of when you start introducing this aspect of kind of space within a given scene, it gives it this different kind of emotional quality, I would say. And it's easy to do, just don't rush it, okay? Now see, when we're learning this too, because like one dot, you know, or one application of it, it's barely visible, so sometimes people get impatient and they want to go with a harder mark. But don't do that, just use repetitive types of tappings and everything is really super easy. What makes it hard is if you're trying to do that type of application with that amount of ink. Okay. Alright, so let's move on here. Now, like I said, I've already gone over some of these. Some of these it's barely visible because it was allowed to dry overnight, and it has become darker. So you can kind of see where I've applied it in here around at the base. I like kind of like a water types of imagery. I like it around crashing waves, off of a lake surface. Oh, especially like at the base of like a waterfall where the water's churning. Okay, but look at that. We can kind of add some of it down. I'm just touching it. I'm not smashing it down. Here's this area of this rock right here. If I want to change that a little bit, I can add a little bit of mist in those trees, maybe at the base of it. I like doing it at the base of things because that's where kind of that low-lying fog would be. You can do it up in the clouds too if you want to. I mean, there's not really a great opportunity, but I can add it up here too, just to soften some areas. It looks great around the cloud cumulus stamp, where it's supposed to look soft anyway, and you can soften up your cloud imagery. Okay, look at this. Look, I'm just kind of lightening up some of my branches again. And that gives them a little bit of dimension. Kind of bottom lighting it a touch. Alright, here's my pad that's super dry. I'll show you how much I've used this before. This is probably 20 years old. Let me see if I can get that shadow showing. See that? Where there's a gigantic indentation in that? It's because I've been going like this for years into it. And see, I can go into this pad right here. See that? Where I'm just full depression like that. It's because this pad is super dry. But it's perfect for this application. I don't have to, you know, dab it off at all. I just know that it's really, really dry. But for you, with your wet pads, don't do that, okay? Really kind of just barely, you know, tap into your pad, or do a little squiggle on the surface, a very light one, and then blot it off before taking it onto your scene, okay? Now, I mean, if I'm dabbing this into a light area, white on light really isn't going to show up very much, so you can kind of dab it in your lighter areas just to kind of spread it around on your cotton swab, and then kind of spread it around a little bit more. You can use sponge applicators or something like that. I usually like the swab, though, because you can see how smash that tip is, you know, and it gives me kind of this feathery application of it down on my scene right here. Don't use those cotton swabs that are really tightly bound, you know, those really cheap, kind of more acrylic ones. I think those are kind of awkward to use. It's like gives you something like a really hard applicator to apply, kind of a softer looking application, okay? Softer applicator, softer look, okay? All right, let's put some mist down here. There's some areas that I didn't do when I was doing that video yesterday, just because, as in all my videos, they get too long. Okay, but let's apply some down here. You can see, kind of see it. See how kind of, yeah, you can do it in these layers like this a little bit. You know, like where there's some mist. Look at the shadow down here. See that? Where it's nice and crisp. Let's change that a little bit. And put a little of this fog in here. And we still have the benefit of a shadow, saying that that area is reflective, but look at that kind of, that area now. I think that looks better, don't you? It still is darker in there, but we have that little layer of mist over the top of it. So on the overall, I think that gives us a really nice kind of atmospheric look to the scene. I can't tell you how many times doing this on a scene at the end, I would say that it has saved, or it saves a lot of scenes that are kind of really not great, you know, or bad. And I think it can make a really good looking scene look much better, okay? It kind of takes it to the next level, because what you're doing is, when we're stamping things out, everything tends to be very crisp. What you want very crisp impressions, right? So everything is fairly sharp. Even when I add those tones in the background, I could make something look a little bit softer, but the textural range is really minimal. But when you do add something in there, okay, you have these little areas of softness to contrast against some things that are very sharp, and you can do it within the images themselves. Soft and sharp, soft and sharp. This whole areas down here is pretty sharp, especially with the little gel pen dots and everything like that. Soft, okay? Otherwise, in stamping, most of the times we don't get those kind of textural variations, and texture is one of those aspects in visual kind of language that it can't be underestimated. And I'll show you a very minimal textural range change in another scene. If you watch my other video there on gel pens, you would have seen it, but I'll show you just what that little touch of pigment ink can really do. All right, now this area in here, this one right here was a very light scene, and I have applied quite a bit of pigment ink to this one right here. I'll show you what I did. Can you see that still smudgy little areas everywhere? That's not like fingerprints or something like that, but that's a lot of pigment ink. And if I would have done my video correct, there you can really see it up here and here. But see, right over here, where you see where it's real shiny, you can't see that kind of dull application of it. It's because this area out here is darker than this area in here, so I didn't apply pigment ink in these areas. If I did, it was very minimal. But there it is in the trees again. Okay? Okay, now here's the one that I was talking about. What is the visual focal point of this? Or kind of visual landing spot? I think it's that little glowing star up there. And that's just adding a little bit of pigment ink right over the top of a gel pen dot. And I've added a little bit down here in terms of the reflection. But here's this kind of real vivid Northern Lights type of thing. And, I think it's really quite dramatic. But then you get that little star in there. This would be a perfect scene for a quote from the Scenic Sentiments sheets on a star. I think I'll do that one on this one. I'll card format this, and I have a perfect quote for that. Little star. I think Starlight, Star Bright, or something like that. I don't know, I have a few, but I've added a little bit of pigment ink down here, but in this scene right here, there's not very much opportunity where light meets dark, right? I mean, I have a little bit of white in here, but it's really not even the white of the card. It's kind of a little bit yellow in here, where I've added kind of this yellow-green in here, so there really isn't a good opportunity for this because there's not a lot of white light to be reflecting off of moisture. So I've just kind of limited it to the that little star in there, the little glowing star. But isn't that fun? Another big thing that I did, now this one right here, I did a lot of gel pen dots in here, but what I did last night was, on some of these larger dots, representing that snowfall, I did that same type of concept as, that last Northern Light scene, but I've kind of made some of these little falling bits of snow softer and kind of illuminated it. It kind of gives it this kind of, I think, a little bit more of like a magical feel to it. And I'll show you what you do. Here, like, say this dot right here, for example. I'll just kind of add a few little taps over the top of it, and from white dot to glowing dot right there. See that? This is a really fantastic application too if you're doing something like lightning bugs, fireflies, and you do a little green gel pen dot, and then you put a little bit of that illumination around it with the white paint. You can do it if you have like a lime green pigment ink pad, maybe you can do that. This is very similar. This is not the same scene as this one right here. It's very similar in composition, but I've stamped out my imagery in this one in gray and this one's in black. But you can see where I've oscillated that background a little bit, okay? See, some of these trees are still black, you know, in the areas. But you can see where I've added that pigment ink in here. See that? Right around here at the base of the water. When you have a lighter scene like this, it really gives you a lot more opportunity for some of these pigment ink applications like that to add that kind of atmospheric atmospheric moisture, I guess you can say. Once you get this kind of the right consistency, you can really keep tapping it. Unless you have an area where you want it really light, you know, one application really goes a long way because of the layering that you're doing. Okay, now some of you are aware that these types of pigment inks don't dry very well on glossy cardstock, okay? Now I'm not stamping an impression with these inks into my glossy cardstock. I'm putting a very thin layer of this onto the glossy cardstock, and it dries just fine because it is so thin. It's probably 1/20th of a, you know, a stamped impression of it. So you don't need to worry about that. And plus, after I'm done with something like this, what I do is I spray seal it with either a workable fixative, spray acrylic. Some people use hairspray or something like that. Be careful if you do that, because just like pastels or chalks on matte paper, sometimes, you know, if you spray seal it, it becomes much darker and you lose some of that pastel type of touches, okay? So you have to kind of spray it from distance, and I'm going to spray these cards after I'm done, and I'll do that in the video and you'll be able to see the changes. But what you want to do is you want to give it a light coating just to seal all of these little touches without obscuring it. And then I hit it again, I allow it to dry again, and then I can hit it with a much stronger saturation. But I don't hit it in my areas where I've applied a lot of that pigment ink too strongly, okay? I give it a very thin layer, okay? But I'll show you how I do that when I do that video. Okay, on this one right here, it's kind of the same thing, you know, what I was talking about with sunset colors. I applied a little bit in these areas right here around my tree, but if I apply too much of this white area down here, let me show you what I mean by that. See this right here? Now I'm purposely applying too much of it. See, that looks weird, okay? It's because it's in shadows and there's not a lot of white light, so I wouldn't get that showing there. But, like I said, Hero Arts and Colorbox, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's every white pigment ink out there except for Brilliance. These pads, even when they're dry, will wipe right out if you don't like it, okay? When I'm applying these colors to these ink applications, a lot of times I just apply too much. So even with the way that I use it now, I use too much, you know. So when I'm talking about, you know, people use too much, I'm talking about myself as well. So a lot of times when I'm doing, let me take a little of that, blot it off. Okay, let's say I'm applying it in here, and sometimes I go overboard and I apply too much, or I don't like it, you know, so much. What I do is I just kind of, I dab it off a little bit. I use my finger, and it comes right off on my finger like that. So a lot of times when I'm doing this, I remove more ink than I apply, okay? Now I'm applying it on there, but I'm removing it, okay? And what's left on here is, you know, a small portion to what I have applied, because oftentimes I'm dabbing it off a little bit where I've applied a little bit too much. Okay, now this one is a really perfect opportunity for, you know, if you want to, adding quite a bit of it. And why is that? Because I've retained the white of the paper All right, so let's take a look at some of these trees up here. Now these trees I did in multiple tones, okay? I added green, light green, and brown into these trees right here. So they're inherently a little bit lighter in some areas, but let's enhance that a little bit more and make those trees bottom look at that. It looks like it's glowing just like that star, you know, little dot on the star, but make these little trees kind of much lighter too. And look at that change of it. It really says to me light visually, but it's the illusion of light hitting those trees, okay? Because I've taken this white pigment ink and I've layered it over the top of those objects in select areas. Don't do it over the whole thing. You know, if I did this big layer of white like that in that white area and then nothing else around here, it would look like a big ball, like an egg of white ink. So what you do is you just add it here and there, and you don't need to worry about it. Don't kind of be too, I don't know, hesitant, I guess, about trying it, because you can always dab off a little bit, or all of it if you want to. Look at these rocks down here, okay? I think they look fine. They're in shadows and everything like that, but let's change that just a touch, okay? And I'll add some of that there. Now look at what that did to it right here. See that right there? It's this little bit of an oscillation. Let's look at these shadows down here again. And that's all that's really needed. A few taps, you know? And now that shadow, the shadow to me looks richer. I didn't go over everything. I've added it over some of it. Okay, here's the base of this water area in here. I'll add a little bit in there. Like that. It kind of puts that mist on the light, doesn't it? Here's a shadow over here. It's really sharp, which I want, but let's soften it up a touch. And that shadow still shows through. It's not like we're trying to cover it up. I think we're enhancing it by expanding on the textural range of it. It's both soft and sharp now, okay? All right, so let's take a look down here. Is there any opportunities for it? Maybe something like that. In the shadowy areas, you want less because there's less light hitting it. That's why it's in shadow. So I'll blot it off a little bit. Let's take a look, see what it looks like at arm's distance. This little tree in here can use a little bit of variation, I think. Like that. I mean, this is really fun stuff. It's super relaxing. It's not relaxing if you have too much ink on here, though. Then it's kind of it's like precarious, you know. It's like I don't want to add too much or something like that. But really take a lot of that ink off, and when you're applying it, it just goes on in a very light application and a very careful application, and it's really fun. And it's super relaxing too. So we don't want to fight with our media, so just don't apply too much at any given time. Okay, that scene could use, let me get down here in the shadows. I can kind of fine tune some of this because I've already started on it. So maybe it's good that for you that I didn't, I did that microphone blunder. Thank you for watching, by the way. Okay, I think that looks really good. Look at these little areas in here. Let's add a little bit more to that. Okay, now here's another aspect of pigment ink applications. They dry darker than they look when they're wet, okay? But sometimes if you want something a lot lighter somewhere, let's just say, for example, I want that area in here, that ink kind of smeared in there a little bit when I was blending my colors in here. So I dragged that green tree and it kind of dragged some green in there. But let's say I want that quite a bit lighter. Well, this ink really isn't very opaque, okay? It's not a real super white when you lay it on here. If you have some colors underneath, it'll show through. That, and no matter how much I build up with these pigment inks, it'll still show through, okay? That's good in a way because we want that translucency as far as our appearance goes, but sometimes we want it a little bit lighter. And sometimes what happens is if you start trying to build it up more and more and more, what happens after a while is it's almost like you're removing it. And that's why, you know, like I said, even when this is dry, you can kind of take it off. It will come off sometimes, you know, the more buildup you do, it just, I don't know, it comes off like a, I don't know, like a dry medium applied on top of a surface that it can be removed from easily, and that's what it is. So Brilliance ink right here is a type of pigment ink that dries, oops, sorry, it dries on glossy cardstock, alright? So sometimes we can go into something like this. My Brilliance pad is very, very old. It looks brand new though, doesn't it? But it isn't. It's, I don't know, 10 years old probably. So let me just dab into that. I'm not being gingerly about this one because I do want quite a bit of it on my applicator here. And I can add this in to this area. So if you want kind of something to be a lot lighter, try some of the Brilliance because you can kind of build it up and it'll dry. But be careful, don't add, you don't want big balls of, you know, white paint. I'm adding this, you know, in a pretty thick application of it because it is light down there anyway. So white on light really doesn't show up too much, and I'm kind of working it into this little area a little bit, okay? I mean, I can't do it on something like this because it'll show up really distinctly. So, oops, I put my knuckle into the pad. Let me look at this right here. On something like, that's really distracting me. Okay. Let's go to this one right here. I think these little glowing little spheres of light could stand to use a little bit more opacity. So I can add some over some of these. I don't think I'll do it on all of them. Maybe some are glowing more than others. And that's where the Brilliance comes in. But I wouldn't recommend starting with the Brilliance. You could if that's all you had. Just be very careful about it and really remove a lot of it. And, I don't know, kind of be definitive about where you want it to go. Because it will dry and set up very quickly. It's not like it stays on or something like that, but almost. Okay, so those got a little bit lighter with the Brilliance. All right, let's see. I think we've gone through all these. All right, so recap. Don't use too much. That's really what this video is all about. Have very little on your applicator. Use a real cotton swab, fray it a little bit, loosen up the tip, and you can do that by kind of, I usually take a little tip like this and I kind of just unravel a little bit, go back and forth, and I just kind of, I don't know, I fray it a touch like that. It's kind of loose. And then when I dab into my pigment ink, and then I'll start tapping that off a little bit, you know, on some sort of, well, let's just do it right here. Let's do it with the hero hues because most of you are going to have very wet pads. I'm barely touching it in there, okay? I probably used too much of it. But let's go on this piece of white paper. I'm just using the black one so you can see it much easier. Okay, I used too much of it. See, I just dabbed it in there like 3 times. Okay, let's take it off a little bit. Alright, this swirling effect looks like it works pretty good to remove. Okay, I think I've removed quite a bit. You can see where it's a lot more opaque, and then as I kind of dab, swirl it around, it became drier on here. Okay, that's about the touch we want. Alright, so let's see how long it takes. 1, 2, 3. See that right there? And then as I do that on this paper, it's kind of flattening out the surface and giving me a good tool to work with, okay? And that's about what we want. See, it's a really soft little application of ink that we're talking about now. See that? And you want more. If you want it brighter, you just tap more like that. But look at that. That's going to give you a ton of control. Now, I mean, being that it's, a very light application of ink, doesn't mean it's going to take you forever. Let's look at this tree right here. Let's bottom light it, okay? So let's go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? Now that tree limb right there is being bottom lit a little bit. Maybe I'll add more. I was going to say it took 5 seconds, but let's add a little bit more so we can see it a little bit more distinctly. Okay, but I don't know. It probably would have taken, a few seconds to do that. But see, I've added a little bit around here. See, that's very crisp, and that's a little bit soft and lit. Here's a little branch right here. Let's add a little bit into that one. I think I took off too much ink here. Or was it this side that I was using? Okay, I think it's this side. Okay. There, I've kind of put it in light a little bit. Yeah, it doesn't take too long. Let's take these trees right here. Okay. Where white meets dark. Right? See that? I mean, this is, 10 seconds or something like that altogether. I mean, it's taking a little longer because I'm talking about it and explaining, but, And if you put too much, just dab a little bit off, and you're ready to go. And it really changes kind of the spirit of the lighting in your scenes. Remember to do it on scenes where you've retained some white. It doesn't have to be on glossy cardstock either. It could be on matte cardstock. It tends to be a little bit more permanent because the pigment ink transfers, it gets into the groove of the paper. But just do it with a very light touch. And then if you don't like it, dab it off instantly, right away. And okay, now that doesn't look good right there. Just dab it off. It's ready to go. All right. Little mist on the lake. Okay. All right. So, dab off. Retain your whites. Where light meets dark. And it's completely removable, especially on glossy. Okay? Use the, I don't know, just use anything except for Brilliance. I mean, there might be another permanent on glossy type of pigment ink that I'm unaware of. If there are, and you know it, please comment in the comment section below. And, I don't know, have fun with light and texture. And, I don't know, fairy dust, as far as like these little magical glowing balls of whatever. Now that's just on those scenes. If you've seen any of my other recent ones, I've kind of done these little spherical balls. It doesn't really represent snow in this one, but it's just this little magical little thing. I did it on the Halloween one like that. Added a lot of little pigment ink applications at the base of some trees, giving it this kind of low-line mist in here. These two are in recent videos as well, but anyway, remove enough ink and you'll have a much easier time than if it's really kind of juicy. So remove that and you're good to go. All right, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Have any questions, drop us a note in the comment section. Visit Stampscapes.com for a lot of information in that information section, and to see, I don't know, tens of thousands of different samples in the gallery section, or hundreds of lessons in the lesson section.